Good morning. My name is Carson Winchester, and my guy was Thomas Andrews, a passenger and part of the crew of the Titanic. Thomas Andrews was an English businessman and a shipbuilder. He was best remembered for being the naval architect that was in charge of the plans for the ocean liner RMS Titanic and was on board the ship during her maiden voyage in the spring of 1912. Andrews was the head of the group of Harland and Wolff workers called the Guarantee Group. They went out on maiden voyages of their ships in order to observe ship operations and spot any necessary improvements. The Titanic was no exception. So Andrews and the rest of his Harland and Wolff group traveled from Belfast to Southampton on the Titanic for the beginning of her voyage on April 10, 1912. Andrews was also one of the men that focused on getting the women and children on the lifeboats before the men in the crew when the Titanic hit the iceberg April 12, 1912. He perished along with more than 1,500 others when the ship sank after hitting the iceberg, and his body was never recovered. Even though he died on the voyage, he was still classified as the hero because he was able to save others and was able to display that action of courage when putting others first before himself. So this tragic accident tells us that in the period in which Andrews was living in, the British idolized the idea of a true hero, someone who would sacrifice himself for a stranger and put others before his own. Based on limited sources about Thomas Andrews, there weren't that many limits to the sources available to me about Thomas Andrews because he was very well known by his actions, so much so that a member of Parliament wanted to write a biography on Mr. Andrews and build a memorial for his sacrifice. These were the blueprints that Thomas Andrews drew up for the Titanic. He drew it up with multiple sections, including the hull, the stern, both port and starboard side, the bow of the boat, as well as each individual room and compliances for the Titanic itself. Given the task that it needed to be the biggest, safest, and most luxurious ship, Mr. Andrews considered all the possible places that the passengers would travel to. So, cafeteria, lounge, a lot of stairwells, big rooms, and also the means of fuel. So each boiler room and smaller rooms for the lower class that was traveling as well. So in this photo, it's just a snapshot of how many people were actually in the Guarantee group. It's recorded on file that out of the 15,000 men of crew that were actually working the Titanic, 3,000 of them were actually given the job Guarantee group. So each of them had a specific role to play on what to look for, what could be improved on, and how to make the ship better, and what adaptations or changes could be made to the Olympia and Britannia. In this picture, you can see Thomas Andrews' grave. It was a representation of the fact that being aboard the Titanic and being one of the main architects for it, slash builders for it, they wanted to represent his greatest achievement and pay him respects for what he did during the Titanic. So yeah. And then this is just a close-up picture of Mr. Andrews, if you didn't see it before, in the second slide. Mr. Andrews overall was a great man. Even in his stature and his career, he still persevered and pushed through trying to get everyone to safety before risking his own life, making sure that not only did the women and men get off, but also the children before them, to protect that early generation, to ensure that they would survive and that they would live. And overall, British newspapers and writers saw that as true heroism, and So much so that they put him in the papers and wrote about him, and even gave him a memorial. So yeah, that's my presentation on Mr. Thomas Andrews. Google has most of the answers if you have any extra questions or would like to learn more about him. Thank you so much, and that's the end.